My name is Caroline and I'm 32 years old. For as long as I can remember, I've had gasoline in my veins and the smell of motor oil has felt more like home to me than any perfume. While my older brother Liam was learning how to charm clients in the polished front office of our family's auto repair empire, I was in the grease and noise of the garage with my father, learning the secret music of a perfectly tuned engine. But when he passed, he left a silence that no engine could fill, and in his will he revealed a truth I had spent my life trying to ignore. He left the entire business to Liam, and to me, the daughter who shared his passion but never, it seemed, his favor. He left only our grandfather's antique toolbox. What I found inside, however, would change everything and lead to a family showdown that was decades in the making. Before I dive into this story of grease, grief, and the sweetest kind of justice, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you've ever felt overlooked or underestimated by the very people who should have believed in you the most, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. And for all the new viewers, please subscribe to join our community of people who know that sometimes you have to fight for your own happy ending. It all began, as most stories do, with the end of something else. My father, Frank Miller, was a titan in our small city. Miller & Son Automotive wasn't just a business. It was an institution. For 50 years, first under my grandfather and then my father, it was the place you went when your car was making a sound you couldn't describe. Dad could diagnose an engine by its cough, could feel a misaligned axle through the soles of his boots. He was a magician with a wrench, a poet of the piston. And I was his shadow, his apprentice, his ghost. From the time I was small enough to need a stool to see over the fender of a Ford pickup, I was there. My first word wasn't mama or dada, it was car. My lullabies were the rhythmic clatter of pneumatic tools and the deep-throated roar of a V8 engine coming to life. Liam, 2 years my senior, was different. He was born for the front office. He had our mother's easy smile and a way of talking that could soothe the most irate customer. He wore tailored suits that never got a speck of grease on them, and his hands were always clean. Dad saw him as the future, the respectable face of the business. "You need a brain for the numbers, Caroline," he'd say, ruffling my oil-stained hair. "And you need a face for the front. Liam's the face." He never said what I was. I was just there, a given, like the smell of gasoline or the stack of worn tires in the corner. I was the hands, but he never gave them a name. I remember one blistering July afternoon when I was about 16. A classic 1968 Mustang had been brought in, a beautiful cherry red machine that had every mechanic in the garage stumped. It had a persistent phantom stutter, a hesitation that would appear and vanish with no rhyme or reason. They had checked the carburetor, the ignition, the fuel lines. Nothing. My father was getting frustrated, his brow furrowed in a way that meant a storm was brewing. I had been watching from the sidelines, cleaning spark plugs and just listening. I heard something no one else did, a tiny, almost imperceptible hiccup in the rhythm of the fuel pump, but only when the engine was hot. I waited until my father went to take a call, then I quietly took a stethoscope, the mechanic's kind, and pressed it against the pump housing. There was a faint, irregular click. A sticky valve. "It's the fuel pump," I said, my voice barely a whisper, to Miguel, our head mechanic. He looked at me, then at the car, skepticism etched on his face. "Just listen when it's hot," I urged. He did. His eyes widened. When my father came back, Miguel explained what I'd found. Dad walked over, listened for himself, and then nodded slowly. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second I saw it. A flicker of immense pride. He didn't say anything, not directly to me, but he clapped Miguel on the shoulder and said, "Good catch." Later that day, I overheard him on the phone with one of his suppliers. "Yeah, the kid figured it out," he'd said, his voice gruff with something I desperately wanted to believe was affection. "She's got the ear." He never said it to my face. That single overheard sentence was a crumb I would hoard for years, a testament to the fact that he saw me, even if he wouldn't admit it. Meanwhile, Liam was celebrating in the front office because he'd negotiated a new, more favorable contract for our shop towels. He was praised openly at the dinner table that night. He was given a bonus. My discovery, the thing that saved the shop hours of labor and a potential hit to its reputation, was never mentioned. It was just part of the background noise, the work that got done. That was the pattern of my life. Liam's successes were announced with trumpets. Mine were absorbed into the concrete floor of the garage, silent and essential. I told myself it didn't matter. The work was the reward. The symphony of a perfectly running engine was my applause. But deep down, a quiet, bitter resentment began to take root. I loved my father, I worshipped him, but I couldn't understand why he built a wall between his pride and his praise when it came to me. When he got sick, it was fast. A diagnosis that felt like a death sentence from the moment the doctor said the words. The Titan began to shrink. The garage, once his kingdom, became a place he could only visit in his memories. Liam took over the day-to-day operations completely, his authority absolute. I stayed in the garage, keeping the heart of the business beating, making sure the quality never slipped. I worked longer hours than ever, driven by a frantic need to keep everything perfect, as if my diligence could somehow bargain with the universe for my father's life. I'd visit him in the evenings, my hands smelling of solvent and steel, and tell him about the cars we'd fixed that day. He would just nod, his eyes distant. "Liam's handling things?" he'd ask. "Yes, Dad," I'd say. "Liam's handling things." The day he died, the world went gray. The garage fell silent for the first time I could remember. The engines, the tools, the radios, all off. The silence was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Liam handled the arrangements, of course. He was efficient, composed, accepting condolences with a practiced, somber grace. I just felt numb. I walked through the empty bays, my hand trailing over the cold metal of a hydraulic lift. This place, this noisy, greasy, beautiful place, was the only real thing I had left of him. It was our sanctuary, our shared language. I couldn't imagine it without him. The will reading was a week later. It was held in a sterile, impersonal lawyer's office downtown. The room felt cold, all mahogany and leather-bound books that had never been read. It was just me, Liam, and our father's lawyer, Mr. Henderson, a man I'd known my whole life. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between me and my brother. He cleared his throat and began to read from the document, his voice a monotonous drone. The legal jargon washed over me until he got to the crux of it. "And to my son Liam Miller, I bequeath my entire ownership stake in Miller & Son Automotive LLC, its assets, its accounts and all associated goodwill. It is my hope that he will lead it into a new era of prosperity." The words hit me like a physical blow. The entire business. Everything. Not a share, not a stake, not even a mention of my 2 decades of service. It was as if I didn't exist. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at Liam. There was no surprise in his expression. Only a cool, practiced neutrality. He knew. He had known this was coming. He had probably helped draft it. The air left my lungs in a silent gasp. I felt a fool. A naive, grease-stained fool who had believed that passion and loyalty would one day be enough. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat again, avoiding my gaze. "There is one other item. To my daughter, Caroline Miller." My heart gave a pathetic little flutter. Maybe there was something. "I leave my father's, her grandfather's toolbox and all of its contents. May she find it as useful as he and I did." A toolbox. He left me a toolbox. The room started to spin. All those years, all those weekends, all the busted knuckles and late nights. All the times I'd chosen a differential over a dance, a timing belt over a date. It all amounted to a box of old tools. The message was so clear, so brutally, exquisitely cruel. "Liam gets the kingdom, you get the tools of the trade. You're the help. You've always been the help." I couldn't breathe. Tears pricked at my eyes, hot and shameful. I refused to let them fall. I would not give Liam the satisfaction. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," I managed to choke out, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. I stood up, my legs trembling. Liam finally looked at me, a flicker of something that might have been pity in his eyes. It was worse than contempt. "Caroline," he said, his voice smooth and placating. "I know this is difficult. Dad and I talked about it. He knew you loved the hands-on stuff, but the business side of things, it's complex. He didn't want to burden you." "Burden me?" The word was a lit match in a room full of gasoline fumes. "Burden me," I repeated, my voice shaking with a rage that was so cold it burned. "I have rebuilt engines that have more complex parts than your entire business plan, Liam. Don't you dare talk to me about being burdened." "See? This is what he meant," Liam said, sighing as if I were a hysterical child. "You're too emotional about it. This is just business." He stood up and straightened his tie. "Look, I'll have the toolbox sent over to your apartment. And we'll need to discuss you vacating the premises. The new owners will want to take possession as soon as possible. The words hung in the air, sharp and deadly as shrapnel. New owners. Liam had the decency to look momentarily uncomfortable. Yes. I've been in negotiations for a few months. With AutoCorp. They're a national chain. They made a very generous offer. The deal is set to close in 3 weeks. Dad approved. It was his final wish for the family's security. It was a lie. I knew it was a lie. My father would never have sold his father's legacy to some soulless corporate chain. Never. He hated those places. He called them chop shops with a fancy logo. This was all Liam. Liam, who saw the garage not as a living, breathing entity, but as a line item on a balance sheet. He was cashing out. Cashing out on our father's life's work, on our grandfather's dream, on my entire existence. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, that it stole the very air from my lungs. I didn't say another word. I turned and walked out of that office, leaving my brother and his inheritance behind. I walked for hours, the city blurring around me, the sounds of traffic a dull roar in my ears. He hadn't just been given the business. He had been given permission to destroy it. And my father, the man I had dedicated my life to, had signed off on it. The toolbox arrived the next day. It was dropped off by 2 of the junior mechanics from the shop, boys I had trained myself. They couldn't look me in the eye. They set it down in the middle of my small living room floor, mumbled their condolences and left as quickly as they could. It sat there for days, a brown leather anwood tombstone in the center of my life. It was a beautiful thing in its own way. My grandfather, a craftsman of the old school, had made it himself. The leather was worn smooth in 100 places, scarred with the ghosts of old oil stains and the nicks of dropped tools. The brass latches were tarnished with age. It smelled of him and of my father, a faint lingering scent of metal, oil and hard work. It was the smell of my childhood. And now it was a symbol of my disinheritance. I circled it for 3 days, unable to touch it. Felt like touching a coffin. On the 4th day Liam called. "Caroline," he said, his voice brisk. "The AutoCorp people are doing their final due diligence. They'll be on site next week. I need you to clear out your personal effects from the garage and the apartment by Friday. I've already arranged for a moving service, my treat." My treat. The condescension was a physical thing, a slime that coated his words. "Where am I supposed to go, Liam?" I asked, my voice flat. "I've taken the liberty of prepaying 2 months' rent on a nice little 1-bedroom across town," he said, as if he were bestowing a great charity. "It's a clean slate for you, Caroline. A chance to start over. Maybe go back to school, find something cleaner. Something cleaner." The final insult. He didn't just want me out of the business. He wanted to scour the grease from my identity, to remake me in his own sterile image. That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not with a loud crack, but with a quiet, cold, final click. The grief and the hurt that had been churning inside me began to cool, to harden into something else. Something solid and unyielding. Bigger. "I'll be out by Friday," I said, and hung up the phone before he could say another word. I stared at the toolbox. It was no longer a tombstone. It was the only piece of my past I had left. If I was going to be cast out, I would at least take my history with me, clean and cared for. I knelt on the floor beside it and finally, with a deep breath, I popped the brass latches. The lid creaked open. Inside, nestled in their worn, custom-cut felt slots, lay the tools. Grandfather's tools. They were heavy, solid, made of American steel. Wrenches worn smooth by my father's hands. Screwdrivers with wooden handles darkened by the sweat of 2 generations. Each one told a story. This was the socket wrench Dad had used to teach me how to change a tire. This was the feeler gauge I'd used to set the valve clearance on my first engine rebuild. Tears I had refused to shed in the lawyer's office now fell freely, splashing onto the worn metal. They weren't just tears of grief anymore. They were tears of rage. For my father's memory, which Liam was so casually discarding. For my grandfather's legacy. For myself. I began to lift the tools out, one by one, intending to clean and oil each one. It was a ritual of mourning, a way to say goodbye. I pulled out the heavy top tray that held the sockets and wrenches. Beneath it was a deeper compartment for hammers and larger tools. As I lifted out a heavy ball-peen hammer, my fingers brushed against the bottom of the box. The leather there felt wrong. It was looser, with a slight give that the taut, glued-down leather on the sides didn't have. My curiosity piqued. I ran my fingers along the edge. I felt a seam. A seam that shouldn't have been there. My heart started to beat a little faster. I pressed down firmly on one corner of the leather floor. It gave way with a soft sigh, revealing the edge of a thin wooden panel. It was a false bottom. My breath caught in my throat. My grandfather had been a man who loved puzzles and secrets. My father had often joked that he had more hiding spots in the garage than he had tools. With trembling fingers, I worked my nails under the edge of the panel and lifted. It came away easily. And there, nestled in the dark, hidden space beneath, was not another tool. It was a long, yellowed envelope, tied with a faded red ribbon. My name, Caroline, was written on the front in my grandfather's elegant old-fashioned script. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely untie the ribbon. Inside the envelope were 2 documents. The first was a letter, the paper so brittle it felt like it might turn to dust in my hands. The second was a thick, folded piece of vellum, adorned with an official-looking seal. I unfolded the letter first. The date at the top was from 30 years ago when I was only 2 years old. "My dearest Caroline," it began, the ink faded but the words clear. "If you are reading this, it means Frank has held to his word and given you my old box. It also likely means I am long gone, and that you have found yourself in a position where you need to know the truth of things. I have seen the way your father looks at your brother. He sees a businessman. He is proud of him, and that is a father's right. But I have seen the way he looks at you even as a babe. He sees his own reflection, the part of himself that loves the grease and the steel. And it scares him. He wants a legacy that wears a suit and tie, not one that wears overalls. He may not have the courage to give you what you deserve. So I will." I had to stop reading, my vision blurred by a fresh wave of tears. My grandfather had seen it. He had seen it all 30 years ago. I took a shaky breath and continued. "Your father owns the business, the name, the accounts. That is his to do with as he pleases. But the land is another matter. The concrete beneath your feet, the very ground Miller and Son Automotive sits upon, was mine. And now, my darling girl, it is yours. The second document in this envelope is the original deed to the commercial plot at 1412 Engine Block Road. It was legally and irrevocably transferred to you on your 2nd birthday. Your father was the custodian, tasked with managing it in trust until you turned 25, at which point full control would pass to you. He was instructed to inform you. If you are only finding this now, it means he failed in that duty. I'm sorry for that more than you know. This land is your birthright. It is your strength. A business can be sold, a name can be changed, but the land endures. What you do with it is up to you. Just know that your old grandfather always believed in you. You have his hands and you have his heart. Don't ever let anyone tell you that's not enough." I dropped the letter into my lap, my mind reeling. The land. The valuable commercial plot that the entire garage sat on. It wasn't my father's to give away. It wasn't Liam's to sell. It was mine. It had been mine for years. I slowly picked up the second document. The deed. There it was, in stark official language. The transfer of property from my grandfather, Alistair Miller, to his granddaughter, Caroline Miller. The date, the signatures, the notary seal. It was all there. My father had hidden it. He had known all these years that I was the rightful owner of the ground beneath his feet, and he had never said a word. He had let me work as a glorified servant on my own property. The sheer weight of that deception was staggering. It wasn't just a failure of duty. It was a betrayal of a depth I couldn't comprehend. And Liam, the brain for the numbers, was about to sell a multi-million-dollar business. A business that, I suddenly realized, had no home. A business that was, for all intents and purposes, a tenant on my land. And he had no idea. The anger that had been simmering inside me now had a focus. It was no longer a wild, helpless rage. It was a cold, sharp, and perfectly calibrated weapon. My grandfather hadn't just left me a box of old tools. He had left me a key. He had left me the entire kingdom hidden in plain sight. Suddenly, my brother had a business with no home, and I had the one thing he couldn't sell. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, exactly what I was going to do. My first move wasn't to confront Liam. That would be foolish, emotional. That was the old Caroline. The new Caroline, the one who was the rightful owner of a prime piece of commercial real estate, was going to be smart. I needed to be sure. I needed a professional. My grandfather's letter mentioned that he had used a lawyer named Samuel Finch, but a quick search told me he had passed away a decade ago. However, his son, Arthur Finch, had taken over the practice. Arthur was a few years older than me, a quiet, bookish man I vaguely remembered from school. His office was a small, cluttered space above a bakery, smelling of old paper and cinnamon. I made an appointment, telling his secretary only that it was about a family property matter. When I sat down in front of Arthur, my grandfather's documents spread on his desk. He looked at me with a cautious curiosity. He was the polar opposite of the corporate sharks Liam dealt with. He wore a rumpled tweed jacket and had kind, intelligent eyes behind thick glasses. He picked up the deed, his touch gentle, almost reverent. He read it, then read it again. He examined the seals, the signatures. He then turned to my grandfather's letter, his expression softening as he read. He was silent for a long time after he finished, just looking at the papers. Finally, he looked up at me, a slow, impressed smile spreading across his face. "Well, Miss Miller," he said, his voice a low, appreciative hum. "It appears your grandfather was a very, very smart man. And a very prescient one. So it's real? It's legally binding?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Real? Miss Miller, this is as real as the floor beneath our feet," he said, tapping the vellum. "This is an ironclad, properly executed and recorded deed of transfer. Your father was the trustee, but his trusteeship expired on your 25th birthday. That was 7 years ago. For the past 7 years, you have been the sole unencumbered owner of that land. Any property taxes paid by the business during that time could even be considered rent." Rent. The word echoed in the small office. My mind was a whirlwind. My brother, he's selling the business. The whole thing. To a national corporation. The deal closes in less than 2 weeks. Arthur leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. His kind eyes now held a glint of steel. "Is he? Well, that is fascinating. Because he's selling a company that is, in effect, a tenant with no lease. A tenant at will. A tenant that can be given notice to vacate at any time. He's not selling a building and the land it sits on. He's selling a collection of equipment and a brand name. And I would wager a very large sum that the price he's getting from this Autocorp is based on the assumption that the real estate is included." "They've been doing tours," I said, remembering the smug-looking men in suits who had walked through the garage with Liam. "They were talking about tearing down Bay 3 to build a bigger, flashier customer lounge." A dry chuckle escaped Arthur's lips. "They can have all the plans they want. They can't so much as hammer a nail into a wall without the landowner's permission. And the landowner," he said, nodding at me, "is you." He leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "Caroline, this is a very powerful position to be in. We need to be strategic. The first thing we do is get a certified modern title report to confirm there have been no subsequent fraudulent filings, which I highly doubt. Then we wait. We let your brother get all the way to the closing table. An 11th-hour revelation has a much more dramatic impact." The plan was terrifying and exhilarating. For the next week, I lived in a state of suspended animation. I packed my apartment as Liam had demanded, boxing up my life into neat, manageable squares. Every evening I met with Arthur. He was meticulous. He not only got the title report, which came back perfectly clean, confirming my ownership, but he also dug up the original trust documents from the county archives. They were explicit. My father was legally obligated to inform me of my ownership on my 25th birthday. His failure to do so was a major breach of his fiduciary duty. Arthur explained that this didn't just make my claim strong. It made any potential counterclaim from Liam's side incredibly weak. While I was planning, Liam was preening. He called me once, his voice dripping with false concern. "Just checking in, Caroline. The movers are confirmed for Friday morning. I hope you're not having too much trouble. I know this is a big change for you." "I'm managing, Liam," I said, my voice carefully neutral. It was amazing how calm I could sound while my heart was pounding like a piston. Good, he said, relieved to have his conscience soothed. "The Autocorp VP is flying in for the signing on Thursday. We're having a small reception at the office to celebrate the new era. You're welcome to come. To say goodbye to the old place." The sheer arrogance of it almost made me laugh. He was inviting me to the funeral of my own life, expecting me to stand there and watch quietly as he sold my birthright. "I don't think so, Liam," I said. "But thank you for the offer. Probably for the best," he said, a hint of relief in his tone. "It might be too emotional for you." "Oh, it was going to be emotional, all right. Just not for me. The day before the signing, I did one last walkthrough of the garage. It was late at night, the only light coming from the pale glow of the security lamps. The smell of oil and old metal filled the air. It was the smell of my entire life. I ran my hand over the scarred workbench where my father had taught me to read a wiring diagram. I touched the cool steel of the engine hoist that had lifted thousands of engines, thousands of problems to be solved. This place wasn't just land and a building. It was a repository of memories, of lessons, of love, even a complicated love like my father's. Liam saw it as an asset to be liquidated. I saw it as a heart that was still beating. I thought about my grandfather's letter. He sees his own reflection, and it scares him. For the first time I think I understood. My father wasn't ashamed of me. He was afraid. He was afraid that I represented the past, the grease and the struggle, while Liam represented the clean, profitable future he craved. In his mind he had to choose one over the other. And in his fear he made a terrible choice. He tried to bury the heart of his own legacy. But he hadn't buried it deep enough. The morning of the signing I felt a strange, unnerving calm. I dressed carefully, not in a suit like Liam, but in clean, dark trousers and a simple, well-made blue blouse. I looked professional, but I still looked like myself. I met Arthur at a coffee shop down the street from the garage. He had a sleek leather briefcase with him containing all our documents. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his kind eyes searching mine. I took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm ready." "Remember," he said, "let them get comfortable. Let your brother give his speech. The higher the pedestal, the harder the fall. We walk in when I give you the signal. We say nothing until I speak. You are the silent, immovable object. I am the voice. Understood?" "Understood," I said. My hands were steady as I picked up my coffee cup. The girl who would have trembled and cried a week ago was gone. In her place was a woman who knew the precise value of the ground she stood on. We watched from the coffee shop window as the AutoCorp executives arrived. A black town car pulled up and a man in a ridiculously expensive suit got out, followed by two younger, leaner lawyer types. Liam met them at the door, his smile wide and beaming, every inch the proud seller. He ushered them into the front office, the one I had never been welcome in. Arthur and I waited another 10 minutes, letting the ink on the contracts get tantalizingly close. Then he nodded at me. "It's time." We stood up and walked calmly across the street, towards the home of Miller and Son. My home. The moment we stepped through the front door, a hush fell over the reception area. Liam's secretary, a woman who had known me my entire life, looked up with wide, startled eyes. She opened her mouth to stop me, but I just gave her a small, tight smile and walked past her desk, heading for the closed door of the conference room. Arthur was right behind me. I could hear the low murmur of voices from inside. I didn't knock. I just turned the handle and pushed the door open. The scene inside was exactly as I'd pictured it. Liam was at the head of the large mahogany table, holding a champagne flute. The AutoCorp VP, a man with silver hair and a predatory smile, was seated to his right. Their lawyers were there, stacks of documents neatly piled in front of them. They all turned to look at me as I entered, their celebratory mood instantly evaporating. Liam's face went through a rapid series of emotions. Surprise, then annoyance, then outright anger. "Caroline, what on earth are you doing? This is a private meeting. I told you." "Hello, Liam," I said, my voice perfectly level. I walked further into the room, Arthur closing the door quietly behind us. I didn't look at Liam. I looked at the silver-haired vice president. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, my calm seeming to unnerve them more than shouting would have. "My name is Caroline Miller. And before any documents are signed today, there's a small matter of property ownership we need to clear up." The AutoCorp VP raised a skeptical eyebrow. He looked at Liam as if to say, "Get rid of her." Liam took a step towards me, his face flushing a deep red. "Caroline, this is not the time or the place. You need to leave. Now." It was then that Arthur stepped forward, placing his briefcase on the table with a soft but definitive thud. "I'm afraid she won't be doing that," he said, his voice polite but firm. "My name is Arthur Finch and I am Ms. Miller's legal counsel. And we are here to inform you, Mr. Knight," he said, addressing the VP directly, "that the sale you are about to finalize is based on a fraudulent premise." A collective gasp went through the room. The AutoCorp lawyers who had been lounging in their chairs, suddenly sat bolt upright. Fraudulent, one of them snapped. That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Finch. It is, Arthur agreed placidly. And it is also the truth. Mr. Liam Miller here is attempting to sell you a business, Miller and Son Automotive. But he has neglected to mention a rather crucial detail. He doesn't own the property on which the business operates. He doesn't own the building. He doesn't own the land. In fact, he is merely a tenant, and his tenancy is about to be terminated. Liam stared, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. What are you talking about? That's insane. My father left me everything. The business, the property, all of it. He left you the business, Liam, I said, speaking for the first time since my entrance. He couldn't leave you the land. Because it was never his to give. Arthur opened his briefcase. He slid 3 documents across the polished table towards the AutoCorp lawyers. Here you will find the original deed of transfer for the commercial plot at 1412 Engine Block Road, dated 30 years ago, naming Ms. Caroline Miller as the sole beneficiary. You will also find the trust agreement, naming her father as trustee, and finally, a current certified title report from the county confirming her unencumbered ownership. I suggest you review them carefully. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rustle of paper as the corporate lawyers snatched up the documents. Their professional skepticism melted into focused concentration, then dawning horror. They passed the papers back and forth, whispering furiously to each other. Mr. Knight, the VP, watched them, his predatory smile long gone, replaced by a mask of cold fury. Liam just stood there, shaking his head in disbelief. This is a trick, he stammered, looking wildly around the room. A forgery. Dad would have told me. Would he? Asked my voice soft. He didn't tell me, and he was legally required to. He hid this, Liam. For 30 years. He hid it in the one place he knew you would never look. A toolbox. One of the AutoCorp lawyers finally looked up, his face pale. He looked at his boss, Mr. Knight, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The deal was dead. He knew it. Mr. Knight pushed his chair back with a loud scrape, the sound echoing in the tense silence. He stood up and fixed Liam with a look of pure ice. You have wasted my time, Mr. Miller. My very valuable time. Did you really think you could sell a multi-million-dollar property that you don't own? Did you think we wouldn't find out? I didn't know. Liam pleaded, his voice cracking. I swear I had no idea. Ignorance is not a defense in cases of material misrepresentation, the lawyer snapped. Our offer was contingent on the inclusion of all real estate assets, free and clear. That contingency has failed. This deal is off. And I would strongly advise you to speak to your own attorney, Mr. Miller. Because ours will be in touch regarding the recovery of our due diligence costs. With that, Mr. Knight and his legal team gathered their papers and stormed out of the room without another word, leaving a trail of shattered expectations in their wake. The champagne bottle sat on the table, unopened. The room was silent again, but this time it was a thick, suffocating silence, filled with the wreckage of Liam's ambition. He stood there for a full minute, just staring at the empty doorway where the AutoCorp executives had disappeared. His face, which had been red with anger, was now a sickly, ashen gray. He slowly turned to face me, his eyes filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. The swagger, the confidence, the condescending superiority, it had all been stripped away, leaving behind something small, pathetic, and utterly defeated. You, he whispered, the word barely audible. You did this. You planned this. You humiliated me. No, Liam, I said, my voice devoid of the triumph I thought I would feel. I just felt a vast, weary emptiness. You did this to yourself. You were so busy trying to cash in on Dad's legacy that you never bothered to understand it. You saw a balance sheet. I saw a foundation. And it turns out the foundation is mine. He sank into the chair at the head of the table, the one that was supposed to be his throne, and buried his face in his hands. A dry, ragged sob escaped him. The sight didn't bring me joy. It just brought a profound sadness for all the wasted years, for the family we could have been. My grandfather had given me the land, but he'd also given me a burden. The power to save our family's true legacy, but also the power to completely destroy my brother. The celebration was over. Now the real reckoning would begin. The silence in the conference room stretched on, thick and heavy with unspoken accusations and 30 years of secrets. Liam finally lifted his head from his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed, not with sorrow but with a raw, desperate fury. "You couldn't just let me have this, could you?" he spat, his voice trembling. "You were always jealous. Hiding in the garage, covered in grease, pretending you were better than me because you could fix things. You just couldn't stand to see me succeed on my own terms." "Your own terms?" I asked, a bitter laugh escaping me. "Your terms were to sell Dad's soul to the highest bidder. This wasn't about success, Liam. This was about greed. You didn't even wait for him to be cold in the ground before you started counting your money." "It's what he wanted," he shouted, slamming his fist on the mahogany table. "He wanted the family to be secure. He wanted me to be free of that dusty, dying relic of a garage. He knew I was destined for more." "He wasn't a relic, Liam," I said, my voice dropping, becoming dangerously quiet. "He was our father. And that relic was his life. It was Granddad's life. It was supposed to be our life. But you were too busy looking at the exit sign to ever appreciate the room you were standing in." Arthur, who had been standing silently by the door, cleared his throat. "Perhaps it would be best if we concluded this discussion. Liam, as Caroline's legal representative, I am formally serving you with notice. The business entity known as Miller & Son Automotive has 30 days to vacate the property at 1412 Engine Block Road. All equipment and assets belonging to the LLC must be removed by that date." Liam stared at him, then at me, the reality of his situation finally crashing down on him. A business with no location was worthless. The equipment was old, and the brand name was now tainted by his failed, fraudulent deal. He had nothing. 30 days, he whispered, his voice hoarse. "That's impossible. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do?" "You could have asked me that question any time in the last month, Liam," I said coolly. "You could have asked me what my plans were when you were kicking me out of my home. You just assumed I'd disappear quietly. You assumed wrong." I turned to leave. I had said everything I needed to say. "Wait," he cried out, a note of pure panic in his voice. He scrambled up from his chair, his composure completely gone. "Caroline, wait. We can work this out. A partnership. 50-50. We can run it together just like we should have from the start. We'll be Miller and Son, and daughter. We'll tell AutoCorp it was a misunderstanding. We can still salvage this." His words, the very ones I might have begged to hear a month ago, now tasted like ash in my mouth. They were born of desperation, not respect. He wasn't offering me a partnership because he valued me. He was offering it because he had no other choice. He was trying to buy back the ground beneath his feet. I stopped at the door and turned back to look at him, at the wreckage of a man who had always seen himself as a king. "It's too late for that, Liam. The time for partnership was when you chose to honor our father's work, not sell it. The time for partnership was when you could have treated me like an equal, not like an inconvenience. You made your choice. You wanted a clean slate. Well, here it is." I looked around the sterile office, at the mahogany table and the leather chairs he'd bought to impress his corporate suitors. "You have 30 days to get your things off my property," I said. Then I walked out of the office and didn't look back. I walked through the reception area, past the stunned secretary, and out the front door into the bright afternoon sun. I didn't go to my packed apartment. I walked around the side of the building and pushed open the heavy door to the main garage. The air inside was cool and still. The familiar smell of gasoline, coolant, and hard work filled my lungs. It smelled like sanity. It smelled like home. I walked to the center of the vast concrete floor, the place where I had learned everything that mattered. I looked up at the high, dusty rafters, at the rows of silent, waiting tools. It was all mine. The weight of it, the responsibility, the freedom, it was immense. I ran my hand over the fender of the old Mustang that was still there, waiting for a part. For the first time there was no sadness, no lingering resentment. There was just a quiet, profound sense of peace. The engine of my own life, which had been stuttering and stalling for so long, had finally, perfectly been tuned. The next 6 months were a blur of controlled chaos. Liam, true to form, tried to fight it. His lawyer sent angry letters full of bluster and empty threats. Arthur handled them with a calm, surgical precision, dismantling every argument until there was nothing left. In the end, Liam had no choice. He sold the garage equipment for pennies on the dollar and vacated the premises on the very last day of his 30-day notice. I didn't see him go. I didn't want to. I found the keys left on the front desk of the empty office, a final, silent admission of defeat. The first thing I did was get rid of the mahogany table. I sold it along with all the other trappings of Liam's brief corporate reign. I used the money to buy a new top-of-the-line diagnostic machine and a hydraulic lift for the back bay. I spent a month just cleaning, scrubbing years of accumulated grime from the walls, repainting the bays in a bright, clean white, and polishing the concrete floor until it shone. I didn't want to erase the history, I wanted to honor it by giving it a fresh start. I designed a new sign. It was simple, navy blue with clean white lettering. It read, Miller's Garage. Not Miller and Son. Just Miller's. It belonged to the name, to the legacy, not to the gender of the person holding the wrench. Reopening was slow at first. Old customers were confused. They'd heard the business had been sold. I put an ad in the local paper, a simple one. The name is Miller. The work is guaranteed. The tradition continues. Slowly they started to come back. First one, then two, then a steady stream. They found the garage cleaner, brighter, but the work was the same. Honest. Thorough. I hired back Miguel, my father's old head mechanic, who had quit in disgust the day Liam announced the sale. I also hired 2 young apprentices from the local vocational school, a boy and a girl, both with a fire in their eyes that I recognized. I was happier than I had ever been in my life. I was working harder than ever, but it was a joyful exhaustion. Every car that rolled out of my garage running perfectly was a victory. Every satisfied customer was a validation. I didn't need anyone's approval anymore. I was building my own legacy on my own land with my own 2 hands. About a year after the showdown, on a cold, rainy Tuesday, the bell on the front office door jingled. I looked up from the invoice I was writing and my heart stopped. It was Liam. He looked diminished. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a cheap-looking raincoat and worn jeans. His face was thinner and there were dark circles under his eyes. He stood there dripping on the welcome mat, looking around the revamped office with a lost expression. Caroline, he said, his voice quiet. Liam, I replied, my voice neutral. I stood up, a wall of professional calm descending over me. What can I do for you? He shuffled his feet, avoiding my eyes. The garage, it looks good. Clean. Thanks. I like it. An awkward silence hung between us. He finally looked up at me and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Shame. The AutoCorp thing, it followed me, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Word gets around. No one in that world would touch me. I lost everything. The money I got from the equipment, it's gone. I've been working a retail job. Stocking shelves. I didn't say anything. I just waited. I wasn't sure if this was a confession or the beginning of a new manipulation. I was wrong, he said, the words sounding like they were being physically pulled from him. About everything. About Dad. About you. I was so desperate to prove I was better than the grease and the noise that I broke everything. He took a shaky breath. I'm sorry, Caroline. For what I did. For what I said. For not seeing you. The apology hung in the air between us. Sounded real. It felt real. But was it the apology of a man who had truly changed, or the apology of a man who had run out of options? I didn't know. What would you do in that situation? Can you ever truly trust someone after a betrayal that deep? He seemed to sense my hesitation. I'm not here to ask for anything, he said quickly, though I knew it was a lie. I wanted to say that. And well, he faltered. I was wondering if you had any positions open. I'll sweep floors. I'll clean parts. I want to learn. I want to understand what it was I threw away. I looked at my brother, this stranger who shared my blood. I thought of my grandfather's letter, of my father's fear. I thought of the empty space where a family used to be. Forgiving him felt impossible. But turning him away felt like repeating the same cycle of rejection that had broken us in the first place. My garage was a place for fixing broken things. Maybe that could extend to more than just cars. My name is Caroline, and I learned that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't a business or a piece of land. It's the strength you find when you're left with nothing but a box of old tools and the will to rebuild. I realized that my father's greatest gift to me wasn't the one he intended to give, but the one he forced me to find for myself. My own worth. It wasn't written in a will or validated by a title. It was forged in oil and steel, and it was mine all along. I had to lose my family's favor to finally find my own. What do you think I should do about Liam? Let me know your advice in the comments below. Have you ever had to make a choice between forgiveness and self-preservation? Share your story, because reading them reminds all of us that we are not alone in our struggles. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and please subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about finding strength in the most unexpected places. Remember, your value is not determined by how others see you, but by how you choose to see yourself. Thank you for joining me.